On April 29, 2025, in a packed hall in Ottawa, Mark Carney walked to the podium in front of more than 600,000 workers, most powerful representatives, and said something no Canadian Prime Minister has said with this level of specificity in decades. He didn't come with talking points. He came with a blueprint, a project list, a dollar figure, a timeline, and a dare. The dare was aimed at anyone who still believed Canada's future depended on Washington's goodwill. It doesn't. And Carney just made that official. This wasn't a speech about construction contracts or union politics. This was a declaration of economic independence wrapped in hard hats and rebar. The core message: Canada is done waiting for permission to build, done waiting for favorable trade winds, done relying on a partner that is turned into a predator. And the vehicle for that transformation? The 600,000 skilled trade workers sitting in that room, and the 1.4 million more Canada is going to need by 2033 to pull it off. Think about that number, 1.4 million. That is not a policy target. That is a mobilization order. Meet Andre. He's 28 years old, lives just outside Hamilton, Ontario, and has been trying to get into an electrical apprenticeship program for 2 years. He passed his aptitude tests. He went to the information sessions. He got on the wait list. He is still on the wait list. While he waits, his rent has gone up 22%. His savings are flat. His father, a pipe fitter who spent 30 years building power plants across southern Ontario, told him the trades were the surest path to a stable life. What his father didn't tell him, because he couldn't have known, was that the path would have this many potholes before it even started. Andre is why this speech matters, not as policy, as a promise. The question is whether this government can keep it. We know what Carney said because we have the full transcript. We know what he promised because those promises are now in the public record, attached to specific programs, specific dollar figures, and specific timelines that can be tracked, measured, and held accountable. This is not spin, it is verifiable. The spring economic update his finance minister tabled the day before this speech backs the core fiscal claims. The deficit projection, coming in $11 billion below the fall forecast, is on the record. The $60 billion expense reduction commitment is on the record. The Build Canada Apprentice Service is funded. The union training expansion is funded. These are not ambitions, they are line items. 3 separate construction industry analysts have confirmed what every hiring manager in the trades already knows. Canada is running a critical shortage of certified skilled workers, and that shortage is about to become catastrophic as infrastructure spending accelerates. The math is brutal. You cannot build a Mackenzie Valley Highway, expand the Port of Montreal, complete Darlington nuclear, and wire up a new national data infrastructure with the workforce Canada currently has. You need bodies, trained bodies, fast. That is the constraint that gives this speech its urgency. Picture the room, the Canadian Building Trades Union's headquarters, 14 international unions, hundreds of delegates. When Carney walked in, he was greeted not with polite applause, but with something closer to relief. Because these are people who have watched government after government come to their hall, make big promises, and then leave infrastructure on the drawing board for 20, 30, sometimes 40 years. The Mackenzie Valley Highway has been talked about since the 1970s. Let that sink in. 50 years of conversation, no road. Carney stood at the podium and said, "Shovels in the ground this summer." He didn't say, "We are exploring." He didn't say, "We are committed to a process." He said this summer, the physical, seasonal, calendar summer of 2025. That is a statement you can hold someone to. That is a statement that either comes true or becomes the centerpiece of every opposition attack ad for the next 18 months. When John Grimshaw, the president of one of the building trades councils in the room, introduced Carney, there was a moment, caught on camera, where Carney leaned in before stepping to the mic and said something private that made Grimshaw laugh. Nobody knows what it was. But what the room read in that moment was a man who had done the work, who had been to the training centers, who knew the names, who wasn't there to perform sincerity. He was there because 14 months ago, he started a conversation with these unions about what it would actually take to rebuild Canada from the inside out. This speech was the answer. And then there was the moment that reframed everything Carney had said before. He brought up Lord Strathcona, the man who built the Canadian Pacific Railway. Carney made a joke. You ever notice how many things are named Strathcona? And the room laughed, and then he landed the gut punch. The CPR was a nation-building project, yes, but the wealth it created flowed almost entirely to one man and a handful of private investors. The workers who laid those tracks died broke in boarding houses from Winnipeg to Vancouver. Canada got the railway. Strathcona got everything else. Carney's message, not this time. Receipt 1. Canada needs 1.4 million additional trade workers by 2033. Right now, only about 1 in 3 apprentices who start a certification program actually finishes it. The dropout rate isn't laziness, it's economics. Apprentices in their first and second year are often earning poverty-level wages while paying for their own tools, transportation, and in some cases training materials, with zero top-up from government. The result? Talented young people who could become master electricians or structural engineers are instead walking off job sites and into warehouse shifts that pay better in the short term and destroy the body over a decade. Canada is losing this generation of tradespeople, one paycheck at a time. The new Team Canada Strong initiative changes the math. Apprentices will now receive an additional $400 per week while in training, on top of employment insurance payments, and a $5,000 completion bonus when they certify. That changes the total compensation picture enough to make staying in the program economically rational for a 23-year-old with rent due. But that's only part of it. Receipt 2. The certification process itself is the enemy. Right now, getting a Red Seal certification in Canada can take 4 to 6 years depending on the trade and the province, with compulsory interprovincial exam requirements that don't always recognize prior learning. The system was designed for a different era. Carney has committed to cutting certification time by at least 50%. That is not a marginal improvement. That is a structural overhaul of how Canada recognizes skilled competency. And it will require every province to cooperate, which is the quiet landmine buried inside that promise. Think about what this means for Andre, still sitting on that wait list outside Hamilton. If the certification pathway is cut from 6 years to 3, and if the waitlist problem is solved through expanded union training centers with federal dollars behind them, Andre could potentially be a certified journeyman electrician before his 32nd birthday. He could be contributing to the new power grid infrastructure, pulling down $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 a year and building toward a pension. Or he could keep waiting, move into a different career, and be counted among the million-plus workers Canada failed to recruit. Here's where it gets more consequential than most people realize. Receipt 3. The Build Canada Apprentice Service will pay employers up to $10,000 toward the salary of a first-year apprentice. This addresses one of the most persistent structural failures in the Canadian trades ecosystem. Most employers, especially small and medium contractors, won't take on a first-year apprentice because the ratio of productivity to cost is unfavorable in year 1. The apprentice is learning, not yet earning. The employer absorbs that risk with no help. The result? First-year slots dry up, the pipeline chokes, and you get the shortage Canada is living in right now. $10,000 per apprentice doesn't solve that entirely, but it changes the decision calculus for enough employers to meaningfully expand entry-level capacity. And that capacity at scale, across $6 billion of investment in the Team Canada Strong program, gets Canada to 100,000 new Red Seal trade workers in 5 years. That is not a pipeline, that is a flood. Here is what every other outlet is missing. They are covering this speech as a labor story, a union speech, a political gesture toward a traditional liberal constituency. That framing completely buries the strategic reality underneath. What Carney announced is not a labor program, it is a sovereignty program wearing a hard hat. Let me translate that for you. When Canada is dependent on American manufacturing, American energy infrastructure, American data systems, and American supply chains, every tariff Donald Trump imposes is a tax on Canadian weakness. The only antidote to that weakness is domestic capacity. Not in 5 generations, now. The trades workforce is the physical infrastructure of sovereignty. You cannot onshore semiconductor manufacturing without electricians who can wire a fab plant. You cannot build a critical minerals supply chain without millwrights and heavy equipment operators. You cannot develop northern energy resources without pipe fitters who can work at -40 degrees in the Mackenzie Delta. The workforce gap is not a labor market problem. It is a national security problem, and Carney just treated it like one. Drop your answer in the comments right now. Do you think Canada can actually certify 100,000 new tradespeople in 5 years? Or is this another promise that dies in provincial bureaucracy? I genuinely want to know what you think happens next. Here is what this speech actually reveals about how Mark Carney thinks, and why the strategic logic underneath it is more coherent than anything Canada's federal government has articulated in at least a generation. First analytical move. Carney is running the playbook of crisis as opportunity. He said it explicitly. The tariff war with the United States is not just a threat. It is the forcing function that makes politically difficult structural investments suddenly viable. In normal times, committing $6 billion to trades training, blowing up certification timelines, and forcing provincial cooperation on interprovincial standards would take years of negotiation. In a trade war, with economic nationalism running high and workers genuinely scared, that same agenda becomes common sense. In plain language, Carney is using Trump's aggression to do things Canadian governments have been too timid to do in peacetime. Second analytical move. The historical callback to the CPR and the Rideau Canal was not nostalgia. It was repositioning. By invoking those projects and then immediately noting who captured the wealth, not the workers, not the communities, but the Strathconas of the world, Carney was drawing a clean line between the old model of nation building and the new one. The old model. Private capital builds the infrastructure, captures most of the value, names things after itself. The new model. Public investment catalyzes infrastructure, worker-owned unions train the workforce, and returns flow broadly. What that actually tells you is that Carney is trying to marry economic nationalism with economic justice, and that combination, if he can sustain it politically, is genuinely harder to attack than either one alone. Third analytical move. Notice what Carney did not do. He did not announce a new crown corporation to build infrastructure. He did not nationalize anything. He did not threaten companies. He used the Buy Canadian policy, the apprenticeship subsidies, and the expanded union training investment as market-shaping tools rather than state control tools. The government is not trying to replace private capital. It is trying to redirect it, to make Canadian labor and Canadian materials the path of least resistance for any company that wants federal contracts. That is a different doctrine than the one many critics assume is driving this government. In plain language, this is not socialism. It is strategic mercantilism, and it has historical precedents that worked. The precedent is South Korea in the 1960s, Germany's apprenticeship model, and to some degree the post-war American GI Bill, all moments where state investment in human capital created generational returns that dwarfed the initial expenditure. Carney is betting that Canada is at that kind of inflection point. The bet is credible. The execution is not guaranteed. Former Bank of Canada Research Director Stephen Gordon has noted that Canada's productivity problem is fundamentally a capital investment problem. Businesses aren't investing enough in training, equipment, or infrastructure. The apprenticeship subsidy directly addresses the training failure. The infrastructure spending directly addresses the equipment and project pipeline failure. When economists who care about productivity and union leaders who care about wages agree that a policy direction is correct, that overlap deserves serious attention. Armin Yelnizyan, one of Canada's most respected labor economists, has argued for years that the trade's workforce shortage is the single most underreported economic story in Canada. Her analysis? Canada has systematically undervalued manual skill for 30 years, pushed young people toward university credentials, and is now facing the consequences in the form of infrastructure delays, housing shortages, and energy bottlenecks that university graduates cannot fix. Carney's speech is the first time a prime minister has said explicitly, in those terms, that the trades are not a fallback, they are the spine. The Canadian Federation of Independent Business has pushed back, arguing that small employers need more flexibility in apprenticeship ratios and less regulatory friction, not just subsidy dollars. That concern is legitimate. The $10,000 first-year salary subsidy helps. But if the certification process reforms don't materialize, if the provinces don't cooperate on streamlining, then the employer-side friction remains, and the pipeline stays choked at the intake. And when both the CFIB and the building trades unions agree that certification reform is necessary, you pay attention. To be fair, the counter-arguments deserve a genuine hearing. Critics on the fiscal right will note that $6 billion in new spending, on top of infrastructure commitments that run into the tens of billions, sits awkwardly against promises of a balanced operating budget within 2 years. The math requires everything to go right. Strong GDP growth, no major external shocks, provincial cooperation, and employer uptake that hits the projected targets. Any one of those assumptions failing makes the deficit picture look worse than the spring economic update projects. Critics on the left will argue that the Buy Canadian framework, while rhetorically powerful, lacks enforcement mechanisms with real teeth. If a federal contractor uses Canadian steel but sources subcomponents from the cheapest global supplier, the nationalist premium evaporates, and the definition of Canadian content in major infrastructure projects has historically been flexible enough to be nearly meaningless. There is also the provincial dimension. Skills training is constitutionally a provincial jurisdiction. Federal dollars can incentivize, but they cannot compel. Alberta, in particular, has its own apprenticeship architecture and its own political interests. If Premier Smith decides that the Team Canada Strong brand is too liberal-coded to adopt, the program's Western reach gets complicated. These are not hypothetical concerns. They are structural features of Canadian federalism that have quietly killed federal workforce initiatives for decades. The pivot back is this. Every one of those counter-arguments applies to the status quo as well. Doing nothing about the skills shortage also has a fiscal cost in delayed infrastructure projects, in imported labor, in housing construction timelines that push home prices further out of reach for another decade. The question is not whether there is risk in this plan. There is. The question is whether the risk of action is greater than the risk of inaction. And on that, the evidence points clearly in one direction. Here is what the next 30 to 90 days look like at ground level. For Andre, still waiting outside Hamilton, the announcement of the Build Canada Apprentice Service means that the employer he has been trying to get to take him on now has a financial reason to say yes. $10,000 toward his first-year salary changes the conversation. He might be on a job site by autumn, or he might not, if the administrative rollout takes longer than the press release. That is the binary he is living in right now. For the broader Canadian economy, the next 90 days will show whether the shovels in the ground promise for the Mackenzie Valley Highway materializes or gets quietly deferred. That one project is the test case. It has been deferred before. If it is deferred again, the credibility of every other infrastructure promise in this speech takes a hit. If it proceeds, it becomes the proof of concept that the rest of the plan is real. Domestically, the political map shifts. The building trades have historically split their support between Liberal and NDP federally, with some conservative-leaning members in the western provinces. This speech is a direct play for the center of that constituency, not the ideological edges, but the workers who just want a government that takes their work seriously and pays the training costs. If Carney can hold that coalition, the political geography of the next election gets more complicated for every other party. Globally, the signal is unmistakable. Canada is accelerating its economic decoupling from American supply chain dependence. Not all at once, not with tariffs or hostility, but through the patient, expensive, structural work of building domestic capacity in energy, minerals, data, and transport. Every port expansion, every northern highway, every trained welder represents a degree of reduced vulnerability to whatever Washington does next. That is the civilizational bet underneath this speech. And the uncomfortable truth it forces is this. The question is not whether Canada can afford to build this workforce. It is whether Canada can afford not to. But here is what this story is really about. It is not about apprenticeship subsidies or certification timelines. It is about whether Canada has the institutional will to invest in itself, consistently, over decades, across government transitions, in a way that it has almost never done before. The Rideau Canal was built. The CPR was built. The St. Lawrence Seaway was built. And then Canada spent the better part of 50 years arguing about whether government should be in the business of building anything at all. The answer to that question this week was yes, loudly, with a price tag attached. Return to Andre one final time. If this plan works, if the certification reforms clear, if the employer subsidies kick in, if the training seats expand, Andre is a journeyman electrician in 3 years. He is wiring hospitals and data centers and hydro transmission lines. He is earning a living wage with a pension behind it. He is pointing at projects the way his father did, saying, "I helped build that." That version of Andre's future is not guaranteed by this speech. But for the first time, it has a mechanism behind it. If the plan fails, if provincial friction, fiscal pressure, or political transition derails it, Andre is still on a wait list at 35. He has moved to a different career. The housing shortage deepens, the infrastructure gap widens, and Canada finds itself in 2033, needing 1.4 million trade workers with the same shortage it has today, only worse. The silence in that gap, the decade of waiting that falls between those two outcomes, is louder than anything Carney said in that speech. Now here are the dates that tell you which version of the future you are watching unfold. Summer 2025, The Mackenzie Valley Highway groundbreaking. If it happens, the plan is real. If it doesn't, start asking questions. September 2025, the first quarterly report on Team Canada's strong enrollment numbers. The government committed to 100,000 workers in 5 years. That is 20,000 per year. The first intake numbers will tell you immediately whether the pipeline is opening or still choked. October 2025, the Federal-Provincial Skills Accord negotiations. The certification reform promise lives or dies in those rooms. Watch Alberta specifically. Spring 2026, the next federal budget. This is where you find out whether the fiscal math holds under real-world conditions or whether the deficit projections were too optimistic. Fall 2026, first election test. Whether Carney's coalition, urban progressives plus trade belt workers plus economic nationalists, holds under electoral pressure. That result will tell you more about the durability of this agenda than any policy document. If you have stayed with this through to the end, you are not a casual observer. You are someone who understands that the decisions being made in Ottawa right now about who trains the workforce, who builds the infrastructure, and who captures the value will shape Canadian life for the next 30 years. This channel exists to decode those decisions before the headlines catch up. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and join the conversation below, because the next move comes fast, and when it does, you will want to have already seen this coming. The real question this speech forces: do you believe governments can still build things that matter, or has that era passed for good? Drop your answer below. Both sides of that debate have a case. Let's hear it.